The elephant lay in the dust, her vast frame folded awkwardly as if the earth itself had pulled her down. The air was dry and sharp, filled with the smell of cracked soil. Her skin sagged loose around her ribs, each breath lifting and falling with effort. A low sound escaped her throat, deep and rough, carrying across the silence of the empty riverbed. It was not the bold trumpet of a healthy giant, but something quieter, more broken, a roar torn from hunger and exhaustion. The land around her offered little mercy. The river, once broad and flowing, was now a scar of sand cutting through the valley. Drought had stripped the trees, leaving branches brittle and colorless. The wind moved through dry grasses, bending them in whispers as vultures circled high above with the patience of shadow. She shifted her trunk toward the ground, dragging it across dust in a slow, searching sweep, as though some hidden morsel might reveal itself. But there was nothing. Her body trembled with the strain of rising, yet her legs refused her. It was then that two rangers appeared at the edge of the clearing, their khaki uniforms faint against the pale horizon. They had followed the sound that carried on the wind, uncertain whether they would find anger, distress, or finality. Now, standing in silence, they measured the scene before them, the hollowed flanks, the stretched hide, the faint glimmer of life that lingered still in her eyes. One lowered his voice as though speaking too loud might break the fragile moment. "She's weak," he said softly, the words barely audible. The men moved with care, not forward, not yet, but to the side, placing themselves where she could see them if she lifted her head. She did, slowly, her trunk curling toward them, not in threat, but in a hesitant recognition of presence. The sound that followed was not the roar of defiance, but a moan of fatigue, long and drawn, vibrating through the stillness. The rangers watched the muscles ripple along her side as she tried again to rise. Her legs pushed at the ground, dust rising in muted clouds, but her weight sank back into the hollow where she had fallen. The effort drained her, leaving her body shuddering. One of the men took a step closer, the leather strap of his canteen brushing against his chest. He knelt and poured water slowly into a shallow fold of earth. The liquid glistened under the sun, the only patch of brightness in the parched land. The elephant's trunk lifted weakly, wavering as though pulled by invisible strings. It found the water, the tip curling over the shallow pool. She drew it in slowly, the sound of her drinking soft but insistent. Drops clung to the coarse hair of her trunk, slipping back into the dust before she pulled again. Each swallow seemed to steady her trembling, if only for a moment. The men stayed back, watching her eyes soften as the water touched her body's need. They did not rush, did not speak beyond quiet murmurs between themselves. Respect guided every motion, the knowledge that trust, fragile as the surface of still water, could be broken by impatience. The sky above was pale, a relentless wash of light that carried no shade. Time seemed suspended as she drank, as though the valley itself had paused its suffering to allow her this moment. Around her, the silence deepened, broken only by the low rumble in her chest, neither protest nor greeting, but something between. At last, her trunk lowered again to the ground. She did not rise, not yet, but her breathing grew steadier, each exhale pushing a soft puff of dust into the air. The rangers exchanged a look, a glance filled not with certainty but with cautious hope. They knew the battle was not water alone. Hunger was carved deep into her frame, each bone a stark map of survival. One ranger crouched, pressing his palm lightly against the earth as if to anchor himself in the moment. "Easy, girl," he whispered, voice carried away almost before it reached her. She shifted her head slightly, eyes meeting the figures nearby. No defiance sparked there, only the dull weight of endurance. As the afternoon sun slipped westward, her shadow stretched long and fragile across the dry bed. The men remained, silent guardians at a respectful distance, their presence steady as stone. The elephant did not rise again that day, but in her quiet, in her roar that still echoed faintly through the valley, there was something unbroken. The dust settled around her, the vultures drifting higher as if turned back by her refusal to yield. The land remained barren, the riverbed dry, yet in that hollow space where she lay, life still moved. Her body trembled less. Her breathing grew into a rhythm that matched the slow cadence of the wind. And though the rangers could not yet know what came next, they stood with her, waiting as the first chapter of her struggle whispered itself into the gathering dusk. The elephant moved with great effort, each step a slow negotiation with the weight of her failing body. Dust clung to her legs as she dragged them forward, her feet pressing shallow prints into the brittle soil. The rangers followed at a distance, careful not to intrude, their footsteps softened by the dry grasses that bent beneath them. They had no need to speak. The silence between them was filled by the sound of her body straining, the low rasp of her breath, and the faint whisper of wind through the trees stripped bare by drought. Her frame carried the harsh story of the land. Ribs stretched stark against her hide, the sharp ridges catching the last of the sun's light. Her spine stood high and pronounced, swaying with each faltering movement. The hollow spaces along her body spoke of weeks without enough food, the land itself unable to offer the nourishment she sought. Even her ears, broad and usually strong, drooped at their edges, flapping only weakly to scatter the flies that followed her. The rangers scanned the terrain. Once, this place had been alive with water and forage, a haven where elephants could rest beneath green canopies. Now, the soil cracked open like dry skin, every blade of grass brittle, every branch brittle to the touch. A silence clung to the valley, the calls of birds rare, the presence of other animals diminished. Drought had carved its mark across every inch of the landscape, and now it carved into her body as well. Still, she pressed forward. Each step was accompanied by a soft grunt, her trunk dragging low to the ground in search of anything. Roots, hidden moisture, the memory of food. Occasionally she paused, curling the trunk around a thorny branch, stripping it of bark before letting it drop again, the effort greater than the nourishment gained. She did not resist the men's presence, though her eyes lingered on them when she paused. There was no spark of aggression, only a dull watchfulness, as if acknowledging their shadowed presence beside her. One of the rangers adjusted the strap of his canteen, whispering words that barely carried through the dry air. "Stay strong," he said softly, not expecting a response, only offering sound where silence threatened to overwhelm. The elephant's ears twitched faintly at the voice, then stilled again, her focus returning to the endless walk. They followed her as the sun lowered. The orange glow stretched long shadows across the valley floor, painting her frail body in lines of light and shadow. The rangers carried no weapons beyond what was necessary for protection, no force in their steps. Their presence was patient, deliberate, a promise that she would not collapse unseen. At one point, she stumbled. Her front leg bent too sharply and her body tilted forward, a heavy groan rising from her chest. Dust leapt into the air as her knees struck the ground. The rangers froze, their bodies tense but still. They did not rush her, for sudden movement would only startle and add fear to her burden. She braced herself, trunk pressed into the earth, hind legs straining until, with a shudder, she rose again. A tremor moved along her flank, but she carried on, her steps uneven but unbroken. The men exchanged a glance, both knowing that she could not carry on forever without food. Yet there was something in her persistence that commanded respect. She had endured drought, hunger, and weakness, but still she moved, still she carried herself forward with the rhythm of survival that had guided elephants for centuries. As twilight deepened, the land grew cooler, though the dryness lingered. Crickets began their faint chorus, a brittle song echoing in the stillness. The elephant paused at the edge of a patch of scrub, her trunk sweeping across the thorn bushes in long arcs. She stripped a few brittle twigs, chewing slowly, her jaw moving with effort. The sound of her eating was dry and hollow, but it was a sound of life. The rangers rested a short distance away, one kneeling in the dust, the other standing. Watched their silhouettes blurred in the fading light, patient observers in her quiet struggle. They offered no interference beyond their presence, no intrusion beyond steady eyes that followed her movements. They had entered her suffering only to ensure it did not pass unseen, to lend what aid they could without taking her wildness away. The elephant turned her head toward them once more. Her eyes caught the dim glow of the setting sun, reflecting it faintly, a dull glimmer of endurance. Her trunk swayed slowly before she lowered it again to the shrubs, continuing her search. Night settled gently across the land, and with it came a fragile bond, not forged by touch nor by words, but by shared endurance. She allowed them near, allowed their quiet shadows to walk beside her, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them. Her spirit had not yet broken, though hunger wrapped itself tight around her. The rangers watched her shape fade into the dim horizon, ribs and bones etched in sharp relief against the dying light. And still she moved, heavy with weakness yet unwilling to yield, carrying her story into the shadows of hunger that night would bring. The last of the daylight stretched across the horizon, painting the valley in muted tones of gold and ash. The elephant stood at the edge of a barren clearing, her frame outlined against the dimming sky. The rangers had kept their steady watch, their shadows following hers, their steps always measured, their silence always respectful. Her movements had grown slower as the evening cooled, her trunk resting often against the ground, her legs trembling beneath her vast but frail body. Hunger weighed heavily, but something deeper stirred within her. It began with a sudden sound, low and rising, torn from the depths of her chest. The call grew into a roar, filling the valley, shattering the fragile quiet of dusk. The rangers froze where they stood, their hands instinctively stilling against their sides. The cry was no ordinary call. It carried a depth that reached bone, a sound of pain and of something unseen. The dry air vibrated with it, echoing off the ridges and trees until the land seemed to tremble with her voice. For a moment, fear settled over the men. They had seen elephants collapse under the weight of famine, had watched bodies surrender where the land gave nothing back. They feared this might be her final cry, the last roar before silence. But as the sound broke and faded into the falling dusk, her body shifted, her flanks tightening, the muscles drawing in waves beneath her skin. The rangers looked at one another, a realization dawning slowly. This was not only the sound of hunger, it was something else. She moved unsteadily, circling in the dust, her trunk curling and lifting in restless arcs. Her ears flared, then folded back, trembling at their tips. The great muscles along her body rippled again, her frame locking into tension before loosening once more. The men had seen enough of the wild to recognize the rhythm, though it arrived in the unlikeliest of moments. She was not only starving, she was heavy with life, and the weight of labor had begun. The elephant groaned again, softer this time, her head lowering as if the earth itself could carry some of her burden. Dust rose around her as she shifted her stance, hind legs bracing against the spasms that rolled through her. Her trunk touched the ground, dragging across it in uneasy sweeps, then lifting to her belly before lowering again. Her eyes, wide and dark, held both exhaustion and an urgency born of survival. The rangers stepped closer, still careful, their boots pressing quiet into the sand. Their breaths were shallow, their presence deliberate but non-threatening. They had not expected to witness this, not from a body so thin, from a creature so hollowed by drought. Yet here it was, unfolding before them in the cooling air, the struggle of life pressing against the shadow of hunger. One of the men whispered, his voice barely audible, "She's not alone." The words carried no certainty, only awe, as though speaking them too clearly might disturb the fragile balance of the moment. The elephant shifted again, her legs trembling, her body leaning heavily to one side. A low rumble pulsed from her throat, not as fierce as the earlier cry, but persistent, layered with effort. The air thickened with tension, the smell of dust and sweat mingling, the sound of insects beginning their night chorus filling the spaces between her groans. The men exchanged another glance, knowing their role was only to watch, to remain steady as this ancient struggle unfolded. Her body tightened again, a long shudder running the length of her frame. She bent her head, her trunk curling against the earth as though to anchor herself. The rangers could see her sides ripple, the shape of strain undeniable. Though her ribs showed, though her spine stood sharp and exposed, something stronger moved beneath. The power of creation, still alive despite her famine. The clearing seemed to shrink around them, all sound narrowing to the groans, the soft shifting of her feet, the deep breath of dusk holding stillness. Her cries rose and fell, some sharp, others drawn out, vibrating into the distance where silence returned too quickly. Each one marked the passage of time, each one a reminder that the valley was not only a place of death, but of persistence. The rangers remained rooted, their hands at their sides, their voices withheld. Their presence was quiet assurance, though no words or actions could lessen her burden. They bore witness as the sky darkened further, the last streaks of light fading into deep blue, the stars beginning to tremble faintly overhead. Her roar came again, not as thunderous as before, but filled with urgency, echoing in waves across the barren riverbed. And with it, a change took hold. Her body shifted in rhythm, contractions rolling like tides, through her frame, signaling what the men now understood fully. This was not the end of her story. Despite the hunger that hollowed her, despite the weight of drought that pressed down upon her, she carried life. The night deepened, shadows lengthening around her as the land fell into quiet. The men stood at the edge of the clearing, their silhouettes watching in stillness. She lowered her body, her breathing labored, her flanks heaving in the rhythm of labor. Dust clung to her skin, the air filled with the smell of dry earth and the sound of effort that would not cease. In the silence that followed her final roar, the valley held its breath. Her struggle had only begun, but in the ranger's eyes, the fear of her collapse had given way to something else, the solemn weight of witnessing survival and birth entangled in the same fragile body. The night settled over the valley in silence, a dark veil stretching across the land. Stars shone faintly above, but their light was thin against the vastness of shadow. The elephant stood within this stillness, her body straining with each wave of labor that rolled through her. Her flanks tightened and released, a rhythm that had carried countless generations of her kind through this same ancient struggle. Dust clung to her hide, sweat darkening the creases around her legs. Each sound she made carried across the emptiness. A groan, a low rumble, a breath heavy with effort. The rangers remained close but still, their silhouettes pressed against the dim horizon. They had no role but to witness, to guard the fragile boundary between her suffering and the dangers of the night. Predators sometimes roamed the outskirts drawn by weakness, but tonight there was only the whisper of wind through dry shrubs and the cadence of her labored breathing. Their presence was quiet assurance, a watchfulness that asked nothing, demanded nothing, but gave the space she needed. She shifted her stance again, hind legs splaying slightly as a shiver ran through her body. Her trunk swept across the ground, drawing a line in the dust before curling to her belly, touching herself with restless tremors. Another contraction gripped her, and her head lifted sharply, a low groan escaping into the darkness. Her body swayed under the force of it, her ribs flaring with the effort to draw breath. The rangers could see the tremors in her limbs, the exhaustion deepening, yet she persisted with the strength of survival bound into her very frame. Time passed slowly. The moon rose pale over the barren land, its light catching her hollowed flanks and trembling sides. Then, at last, a new sound joined the night. A wet, heavy thud as something fragile slipped into the dust. The mother shifted, her trunk reaching instinctively, pulling close the small, glistening form that now lay before her. A calf, no larger than her head and shoulders combined, but breathing, its chest rising in tiny jerks. Its legs twitched weakly, splayed against the ground as though the weight of the world had come too soon. The mother bent low, her trunk sweeping over the calf's slick body, brushing dust from its skin, nudging it gently. She rumbled softly, the tone no longer filled with pain but with a trembling tenderness. The calf stirred under her touch, its ears flicking, its mouth opening in a faint gasp as it tested the air. The rangers, standing in silence, felt the heaviness of the moment settle upon them. This frail spark of life brought forth in the very heart of hunger. The calf tried to move, its legs folding and stretching clumsily. It pushed against the ground, trembling under its own small weight. The mother guided it, her trunk pressing lightly to its side, lifting it with gestures that carried both urgency and care. Again and again the calf fell back into the dust, each collapse sending a puff into the air, but it persisted. Its will was not yet shaped by strength, but by the raw instinct to rise. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The rangers kept their distance, their breaths measured, their eyes steady. One whispered softly, "Come on, little one," though the words were swallowed almost immediately by the night air. They did not dare approach, knowing their presence was already gift enough, protection from afar, not interference. At last, with a tremor that shook its thin frame, the calf managed to brace its legs beneath it. Wobbling, swaying, it lifted itself from the dust. Its body quivered with the effort, but it stood, its head lifted awkwardly toward the towering shadow of its mother. She lowered her trunk, pressing it along the calf's side, brushing over its back as though to steady it. A low, vibrating rumble passed between them, a sound of recognition, of bond, of survival shared in the most fragile of hours. The mother remained unsteady herself, hunger etched deep into her form. Her ribs pressed as sharp lines beneath her skin, her shoulders sunken. Yet beside her, the calf's presence shifted something in the air. The night no longer held only weakness and despair. It carried with it a thread of renewal. The rangers watched, their eyes following every stumble, every nudge of the mother's trunk, every fragile breath drawn by the calf. Around them, the land stayed barren. But here, in the hollow of the clearing, hope had broken through the dust. The men exchanged a glance, their expressions quiet, reverent. They knew the days ahead would not be easy, not for mother nor calf, yet in this moment the valley had been transformed. The calf leaned against its mother's leg, small and unsteady, but alive. She stood over it, her vast shadow encircling its fragile form, her trunk resting across its back in a gesture of protection. Together, they faced the emptiness of the night, two lives tethered by need, by resilience, and by the unyielding rhythm of survival. And as dawn began to press faint light into the edges of the horizon, the first notes of birdsong returned to the valley. It was faint, fragile, like the calf itself, but it was there. A sound that marked not just survival, but the fragile beginning of something new. The first light of dawn stretched across the valley, brushing the dust with pale silver. The mother stood over her calf, her trunk resting gently across its back as it leaned unsteadily against her. The air was cooler now, though dry, carrying the scent of parched earth and the faint rustle of brittle grass. For hours she had guarded her newborn, nudging it forward each time its legs buckled, guiding it with patience carved from exhaustion. The rangers, still at a distance, had watched the rhythm of this fragile beginning in silence, their presence like stones placed quietly at the edge of the clearing. Then came a sound, faint at first, drifting through the valley like a memory. It was the low murmur of elephants, deep, resonant rumbles that traveled farther than sight. The mother's ears lifted, her body stiffening slightly as she turned her head. She answered with a low, trembling call, the sound carrying into the emptiness. For a moment all was still, as if the land itself waited. Then movement stirred on the horizon, dark shapes rising from the pale line of light. The herd came slowly, their silhouettes forming against the dawn. Their steps were deliberate, their bodies dusted in the pale glow of morning. Each one moved with purpose, drawn by the echoes of her cries in the night. The rangers shifted their weight but did not move forward. They knew instinct would now guide what followed, not human hands. The mother stayed rooted, her calf pressed close to her leg. Her trunk hovered protectively above its back, a trembling barrier against what approached. But as the herd drew near, their rumbles deepened into a chorus of recognition. They spread around her in a loose circle, their large bodies forming a wall of flesh and bone, their trunks reaching toward her, brushing the ground in slow, steady arcs. There was no aggression in their movement, only the gravity of kinship, a silent gathering of guardians around a mother who had endured alone. The calf stumbled again, its legs bowing awkwardly as it tried to stand straighter. A younger female stepped closer, lowering her trunk to touch the calf's back, steadying it with a gentle nudge. The calf swayed, then braced itself more firmly. A low vibration pulsed through the circle, a sound that seemed to move through the ground itself. It was the voice of the herd, welcoming the fragile life into their fold. The mother shifted her weight, her exhaustion plain, yet her head lifted higher now. Her eyes followed the movements around her as trunks reached, as rumbles echoed. Her body, thin and hollow from hunger, was no less dignified for its frailty. She leaned lightly against the calf, the weight of her trunk draped across its shoulders, as if drawing strength from the small body that trembled beside her. The rangers watched, still and reverent. They had seen animals fall to drought, seen silence settle where once there had been life. But this was different. Here, in the circle of elephants, there was survival, not only of one, but of many. The herd's arrival meant protection, shared burden, a chance that hunger alone could not erase. One of the men whispered, his voice rough from the hours of silence. "She made it." The words were scarcely louder than the wind, carried away almost as soon as they left his mouth. The other only nodded, his eyes fixed on the calf as it braced itself against the morning light. The circle of elephants tightened, shifting with slow assurance until the mother and calf were enclosed within a living wall. Dust rose from their steps, hanging in the air like smoke. The calf pressed forward, nudged by its mother, and managed a few uneven strides. The herd parted to let it move, then closed again, the great bodies forming a shield around its trembling frame. Each rumble, each gentle brush of a trunk, became a part of the ceremony of its arrival. The rangers knew their part was finished. There was nothing more they could give beyond what they had already offered, their watch, their water, their silent respect. They began to step back, their movements quiet, leaving the circle intact. None of the elephants turned to watch them go. Their focus was inward now, toward the calf and the mother who had endured the long night. As the men walked away, the light grew stronger, spilling gold across the valley floor. Behind them, the herd remained clustered, a slow-moving fortress of patience and care. The calf stumbled once more but rose again, its steps steadier than before, its breath drawing deeper into the rhythm of life. The mother's trunk lingered against its side, trembling less now, as though steadied by the strength gathered around her. The land was still barren, the drought still carved deep into soil and skin. Yet within that circle, something had shifted. The elephants, once starving and silent, now stood as a testament to endurance, a reminder that even in the harshest seasons, life could emerge, fragile but unbroken. The rangers paused at the ridge before disappearing from sight. They turned once to look back, watching the herd in the morning light, a single calf sheltered in a fortress of giants, a mother held upright by kinship. The wind stirred the dry grasses, carrying the faint echoes of rumbles across the land. And in that sound, carried softly into the silence, hope lingered like the first cool breath of rain yet to come.